Pixar has one foot in the grave already. After a chain of poor movies and predictable sequels, the studio's been in a tailspin for years. Like most of Disney's conquests, Pixar has been sucked dry and tossed aside, pillaged of its creativity and turned into just another part of the Disney empire. So where did the magic go? How did Pixar go from being Steve Jobs' invincible juggernaut without a single failure to the flop machine we see today? And is there any hope of a renaissance at Pixar, or have they already seen their best days? Well, to know exactly what's killing Pixar today, we need to understand why it was so successful in the first place. In 2 words, it was because of John Lasseter. His story is Pixar's story, and they've been floundering ever since he left. Unlike other movie executives that came from money and never had anything to do with the business they own, John began as a lowly animator at the very bottom of the ladder. Even as a student though, his talent and his creativity were plain to see. At university, he was taught by retired animators who had worked with Walt Disney himself in their golden age. His final project, Lady in the Lamp, showcased his talent for injecting life into the most mundane of objects. Out of 10,000 animator applications, he was one of the 45 that was offered a permanent job. But it wasn't the dream job that he'd hoped for. And so after just a few years at Disney, John was disappointed. He thought that the studio had plateaued and started to decline long ago. Now it was just repeating itself and pushing out unoriginal subpar films. At the same time, Lasseter had become aware of promising new technologies and techniques in computer animation. Immediately seeing the potential in the new medium, John was eager to get started. Unfortunately though, it was still the early 80s, and computer-generated graphics were in their early infancy. At the same time, Disney was still using an arcane tool called a multi-plane camera to create depth and a 3D feel in their animations. Using this setup, different pictures could be moved past a set of camera lenses at different speeds and distances, creating a 3D feel to their characters. John and his fellow animators were eager to finally reach true 3D, which they knew would be possible with CGI backgrounds and later characters. But when they tried to push the executives at Disney to back their plans up, it all blew up in their faces. After pulling out all the stops, working day and night and cashing in every favor they could, John and his colleagues finally succeeded. They got Disney to greenlight a project using background CGI with traditionally animated characters, but to do so, they went past their direct bosses and upset the hierarchy. Mid-pitch to some executives, John got called into his boss's office and was told he'd be fired. While it was crushing at the time, it would turn out to be a pivotal moment in John's career. Through his work with computer animation, John had made very valuable connections in the tech industry. It was through them that he quickly landed a job at Lucasfilm, who were at the cutting edge of computer animation. Here he kept working on CGI and the technology kept improving. A few years later, and after some excellent progress and the first fully CGI character on film, everything went haywire again. George Lucas got divorced and it destroyed his finances, so much so that he was forced to sell off Lucasfilm CGI and the computer animation studio. And in an odd twist of fate, it was bought by Steve Jobs, who put John into a commanding position at the company.
And I first got involved in this when I heard about this incredible group of computer graphics specialists that George Lucas had assembled at Lucasfilm that he wanted to sell. Told me about his dream, which was to make the first computer animated feature film someday, and showed me what this team was working on. And I was blown away.
The meeting couldn't have come at a better time for both the men. Steve Jobs' power at Apple was slipping. After poor sales with the Mac and being on the losing side of an internal power struggle, Jobs was forced out of his dream. Meanwhile, Lasseter had been pushed out of his world. He had big dreams, but he didn't have the money or the manpower to get it off the ground. So when the two visionaries met for the first time, it was a match made in heaven. Jobs agreed to buy the struggling company off of Lucasfilms for $5 million, investing a further $5 million straight into the company. From there, they built the newly christened Pixar Studios from the ground up. First, they worked on side projects, adding CGI to other studios' films, and making short pieces to test the limits of the technology. Over time, they kept getting larger and larger projects, more generous contracts, and a larger staff to work with. It wasn't an easy journey by any means though. At first, Jobs had Pixar making technology and hardware to try and corner the industry as it took off. They were successful in some ways, creating a highly specialized computer graphics machine, but it only had niche use in hospitals and animation studios. That and the $135,000 price tag meant it never sold more than 100 or so units. Jobs constantly had to keep the company propped up, putting more and more of his personal funds into keeping it alive. But unlike the domineering, results-oriented CEO some people at Apple described, Jobs was the opposite of Pixar. Despite bankrolling the whole operation, he was forgiving and receptive to new ideas. If Lasseter asked him to fund a short film, or another employee wanted to explore something else, he was happy to write the check. Jobs was often involved in the creative process itself, checking in to give his opinion on new projects or films. Some sources say he was losing $1 million a year on the company, but he knew that he had something far more valuable. But before we continue, I want to talk about a video sponsor. Have you ever Googled yourself and was shocked to see your personal information exposed on one of those public listing sites? Data brokers are making a fortune selling your information to robocallers, spammers, and others who want to learn more about you, like where you live. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura can identify data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Now, brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but if they make it super hard to do, let Aura handle it for you. And you can try Aura for free for 2 weeks using my link. Aura also does so much to protect you and your family from online threats you can't see. It's super easy to set up, and you don't have to download several different apps to get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. Instead, you get everything in one at an affordable price. So let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online so that you can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. You can either let people continue to exploit and profit off your private information, or you can go to aura.com/moon to start your 2-week free trial, also linked down in the description below. Other than the massive potential of Pixar, the short films that John Lasseter was making were one of the only redeeming factors. One of these films, a short called Lux Jr., was the first animation to showcase how seamless and captivating computer animation could really be. It was eventually nominated for an Academy Award, the first computer animation to receive the honor. Other than that, Pixar also plied their trade in commercials, bringing toys or products to life. And it was the quality and the promise of these shorts, mostly spearheaded by John Lasseter, that convinced Jobs that Pixar should become a true movie studio. It was a dream that was shared by the employees and founders of Pixar.
You know, Spielberg and Lucas and Star Wars had come out, man, and like Raging Bull, come on, we could do this in animation, you know? And that's how we felt. We said, we want to make movies for everybody. We believe in it. And we literally were the only ones that believed that.
And by the early 90s, John and his colleagues were in talks to turn the animation company into its own studio. And the help would come from an unexpected source. Disney had regretted firing Tom for years. His aggressive plans and original thinking were exactly what they had needed, but instead they tossed him aside. Now that he was making it big with Pixar, they were desperate to get him back, but he refused every offer. John was determined to stay with Steve Jobs and Pixar, so they eventually reached a compromise. Pixar entered into a deal with Disney, but they would get a massive long-term contract to make 3 feature films entirely from CG animation.
Pixar has a 3-picture deal with Disney, so I'll be doing the Toy Story is the first one, so I'll be doing at least 2 more computer animated movies for Disney.
Considering nobody had ever done it before, it was a big vote of confidence. Disney would bankroll the operation and get them some big names. Pixar would actually make the movie.
Pixar, who made the film, we were working with Disney, and they had the ability to call, Tom Hanks and Tim Allen and Don Rickles and the big stars to be able to work with us.
Jobs had his hand in the deal as well, of course. In fact, he made yet another genius decision, staking the whole company's future on their first film. Jobs had since come back into power at Apple, so seeking to focus on it fully, he was willing to hand over at least part of his share in Pixar. He put the company forward for an initial public offering, scheduled for 1 week after Toy Story's release. The entire company's value hinged on the film anyway. Poor results would lead to Disney cutting the contract short and Pixar going back to commercials. The first of these films was Toy Story, John Lasseter's personal passion project.
Toy Story is the first fully computer animated feature film. It being the first one, it's revolutionary, and it's also by the fact that no one else had made a film like this, we were really like kind of jumping into the deep end of a swimming pool to learn how to swim.
In hindsight, it's no surprise the film made over 13 times its $30 million budget. John had been bringing inanimate objects to life for decades by the time it came out. His vision and his direction were what made it a modern classic. Everything about it was original, the setting, the characters, the way they made it. Even the people making it were new to feature films. They broke through the limits of the time with the setting. The people might have looked weird, but the glossy geometric nature of early CGI meant that the toys looked incredibly good. Even today, it still stands up. For Jobs, it was a dream come true as well. The IPO week after its release saw Pixar shares nearly double in value. At one point, the stock market systems got so overwhelmed with people trying to buy Pixar shares, they had to delay everything by 30 minutes to deal with all the trades. A company that had been struggling fruitlessly for years was now suddenly worth over $1.5 billion. And it was all because of John Lasseter, Steve Jobs, and the other talented animators and executives of the company. They'd all come together to create Toy Story, and it propelled Pixar into a new golden age. But what sealed its place in history was the story and its heart. John and his colleagues had all seen Disney's troubled decades. They knew that visuals and art weren't everything. They weren't making a product, they were creating a world. Disney fought them at every turn, trying to make the characters more sellable or trying to dumb down the story. Pixar resisted, and their insane success got Disney to leave them alone afterwards.
Toy Story is a success, not because it's computer generated. It's a success because it has, the characters of Buzz Lightyear and Woody, and in the storyline that really has captivated audiences. But what Pixar does that's so extraordinary is that we have taken a look at this new technology, computer animation, and we don't look at it as a way to replace any of the creativity or any of the real art of filmmaking. We look at it as these are just great new expensive pencils.
Using Toy Story as a springboard, Pixar spent the next 10 years making masterpiece after masterpiece. It was a result of techniques and strategies they'd learned during the making of the film. Creative decisions hadn't been made solely by Lasseter or anyone else. Instead, everything was worked on collaboratively. Creative executives, who all had similar prestige and experience to Lasseter, would constantly critique and work on each other's parts in the process. And the next 3 movies were a result of this process. A Bug's Life released in 1998, Toy Story 2 a year later, and Monsters Inc. a couple years after that. Each release was a smash hit. People fell in love with Pixar's ability to make heartfelt films that enraptured children with just enough edge to keep everyone else entertained. And on the business side of things, the company was now in a transitional phase. As Pixar gained more accolades, its value shot through the roof. Disney and Pixar's original deal was a sort of partnership, with the two companies sharing the costs and the profits. But Jobs wanted to get out from under Disney's thumb, whilst Disney wanted more control for themselves. Plus, Steve Jobs and Disney CEO Michael Eisner could barely stand each other. Negotiations slowed to a crawl, until Disney's board stepped in to remove Eisner and appoint Bob Iger. Now Iger was more willing to negotiate, and he reached out with an offer. Jobs saw Disney for what it was, a monolith that eventually swallows and consumes everything it touches. He knew that without a concrete agreement about their creative autonomy, Disney would eventually take everything of value from Pixar and leave it as a husk of its former self. So when they finally reached an agreement, Jobs did agree to sell the company to Disney for $7.4 billion. Considering he had bought it for $5 million just a couple decades before, this turned out to be one of the most brilliant investments of all time. But what was much more important than the money was that Steve Jobs managed to preserve the unique company culture that made Pixar special.
At Pixar, we make movies, the kind of movies we like to watch. It's not an auteur thing. It is because we love movies. We love the way movies make you feel. When you go to those movies that just you cry in and just like, or you laugh or all that. It's like that's the kind of movies, that we want to make.
Lasseter and his colleagues were left in control of the company's creative future, something which would prove absolutely pivotal for the company. From 1995 all the way until 2010, Pixar was absolutely unstoppable. It's not an exaggeration to say that every film they released was worth its weight in gold. Finding Nemo was the 5th film by Pixar, and it's possibly their most influential. These films dominated culture ever since with its timeless stories and imaginative settings. But what really blew people away was how authentic the characters felt and how well the audiences could connect with them. Most other studios would have rested on their laurels and tried to just repeat their earlier successes. It's definitely the route that Disney would have taken. But Pixar were different. They knew that they needed to keep innovating and adapting to keep their winning streak, and the next 10 years would be defined by this need to stay original. Every film had a different story, a different world, and a different message. The Incredibles, Cars, Ratatouille, WALL-E, and Up all came out in this period. Each was the passion project of one of their creative geniuses at Pixar, brought to life by the talent and vision of their animators. But this wouldn't last forever, of course, and as Pixar kept going, Steve Jobs' influence began to fade, and Pixar's deal to stay mostly independent began to fall apart. It was doubtlessly Disney's meddling that led to Pixar's downfall, but it wouldn't happen all at once. Beginning with Toy Story 3, Pixar began to focus much more on sequels as opposed to original ideas. It didn't detract from the quality at first. Toy Story 3 was a great movie, giving a tear-jerking, satisfying ending to the series. Movies like Cars 2 and Monsters University also didn't disappoint. Lasseter was still highly involved in the process, lending his direction to Cars 2 and doing some of the writing for Toy Story 3. He was also instrumental in Disney's few successes in recent years. Frozen, which propped up the studio's reputation for years, was also spearheaded by him. And whilst the 2010s Pixar films still had the spirit of their earlier work, Disney's increasing influence was also clearly visible. Plotlines and stories were recycled, messages rehashed. The company was out of its golden age and into an age of sequels. From 2010 to early 2017, Pixar released 8 feature films in total, but only 3 were original properties, and even they were reminiscent of earlier work by the studio. Some of them failed to impress entirely. The Good Dinosaur came and went with barely anyone noticing. Even Pixar themselves seemed like they just wanted to forget it existed even as they released it. And soon enough, Pixar was turning into everything Steve Jobs and John Lasseter had been afraid of, a studio relying on its past achievements and nostalgia, rather than experimentation and new creativity. He wouldn't have to leave off his own accord either. Lasseter would end up getting forced out over a harassment scandal. The man who turned Pixar into a cinematic juggernaut was tossed aside. Details of the allegations are murky, but they were far from criminal. Lots of people spoke up in his favor. After teams of lawyers went through it all, nothing truly serious ever came up. He would end up taking a role at an independent studio 2 years later, under Apple's control again. But with Lasseter gone, and lots of the old guard leaving with him, things would only get worse for Pixar, as Disney seemed determined to suck Pixar dry. They released sequel after sequel, taking the most nostalgic parts of Pixar's canon and using it for profit. Toy Story 4, whilst a good movie in a lot of ways, was unneeded. The third film had completed the trilogy and ended the story. The fourth felt like a step too far, and now they've announced that a fifth film is in the works. It made over $1 billion at the box office, but how much of that was from nostalgia? Then when the pandemic hit, Disney kneecapped Pixar by forcing all of their films on their streaming service, even after the cinemas began reopening. Desperate to take a chunk of the saturated streaming market, they killed the next 3 Pixar films to give Disney Plus a little more content. Soul, Luca, and Turning Red all failed to make a splash after bypassing a cinematic release. It hasn't worked, of course. Disney has been losing millions of subscribers as they hike the subscription fees over and over again. But even with these factors, the question still remains, why did these sequels feel so boring? How did Pixar start losing its magic? Was it just penny pinching from Disney that ruined the company? Well, not entirely. You see, in the realm of animation, certain movies have the power to redefine industry standards and shift the trajectory of storytelling techniques. And this is what made Pixar so successful. They were at the cutting edge of animation technology, but in recent years, they've lost their edge to companies like Sony. Now, Sony has infamously had a bad run of animation movies, making films like the Emoji Movie. But in recent years, Sony has pushed the edge, most famously with its movie Into the Spider-Verse, which did exactly what Pixar used to do. This film, with its compelling narrative and pioneering animation style, stood in stark contrast to the hyper-realism that's become synonymous with Pixar. By blending 2D animation over 3D and manipulating the frame rate, Spider-Verse captured the essence of a comic book, proving that the pursuit of realism wasn't the sole path to future animation. And the finances of the Spider-Verse also highlighted this point. With a budget of only $90 million, a fraction of what many Pixar films demand, Spider-Verse achieved both critical acclaim and commercial success. All whilst targeting an older demographic, not solely focused on children like Pixar, allowing Sony to pioneer a whole new genre of film. Its Oscar win was a testament to its brilliance, signaling a potential paradigm shift in the animation industry, as studios began to recognize the value of prioritizing unique art styles and narratives over exorbitant budgets and hyper-realism, all with flat plastic rehashed storytelling. And the Spider-Verse success raised eyebrows, because when a movie with such a modest budget could achieve monumental success without even focusing on just kids, questions about cost effectiveness and return on investment became inevitable, which was a wake-up call for Pixar. Which is why Pixar has recently found itself at a crossroads. The studio is renowned for its unparalleled storytelling, has now begun grappling with challenges that seem to emerge in tandem with innovative films like Into the Spider-Verse. And Pixar's transition into the Disney Plus streaming model, Pixar has not only been milked dry by Disney, but has also been stunted creatively. And so at this crossroads, this begs the question, does Pixar innovate, target a new demographic, and change its style completely? Or would it, instead of innovating, continue to become a cash cow, making the money off its old name? Well, unsurprisingly, it chose the latter. Films such as Soul and Luca, despite their visual brilliance, came with such huge production costs that they were terrible investments. Nobody even remembered them. If you spoke to people on the street about recent Pixar movies, nobody would even remember their recent releases. With their limited cinema releases, coupled with their exclusive streaming in certain regions, completely hindered their profitability and creativity. And Lightyear only further compounded Pixar's challenges. At first, this movie was anticipated by many. A new sequel from the Toy Story franchise, one of Pixar's most beloved stories, ended up becoming just another woke flop, as it pushed progressive messaging and forced a woke ideology onto children, leading the movie to actually be banned in several regions and hated by families across America. Coupled with its astronomical production cost, and the film's financial performance was a disaster, causing layoffs to shake the foundation of the studio, as Disney was forced to cut the costs down. But in these layoffs included people who were instrumental in Pixar's golden era, and now they were being shown the door. And so the internal strife, along with the external challenges, has put the studio in a crisis, searching for its footing in a rapidly evolving industry. And it seems like Disney's decisions for Pixar are now dimming the once bright star of a studio known for its unparalleled cinematic brilliance, as Pixar's magic lay in its exploration of the unknown, crafting tales that touched not just children, but hearts across all age groups. Anybody could watch Pixar movies and be moved by them. They were pioneering creative ways to animate stories. In fact, the whole studio was just a haven for creativity and innovation. But with Lasseter and Steve Jobs' departure, and Disney's increasing influence, the foundational ethos of Pixar began to waver. The transformation of Pixar into a sequel factory for Disney underscores the dangers of a dominant corporation stifling a culture of ceaseless innovation. The decline of Pixar isn't just about the departure of John Lasseter, it's about the erosion of a culture that prioritized storytelling over revenue, ingenuity over wokeness, and Disney's overarching influence over Pixar has overshadowed the core principles that once set it apart, tethering Pixar to the commercial objectives of a parent company, making Pixar a cash cow over a beloved filmmaker. John Lasseter and Steve Jobs weren't just producing films, they were creating legacies, but sadly the legacy of Pixar now appears to be auctioned to the highest bidder, serving as a stark reminder of the pitfalls of the corporatization of creativity, of when box office figures overshadows compelling narratives, when political ideologies become more important than creativity.